look at the review. So I'm gonna go through this, review some things, and then we'll actually get to the review piece of it. So as a review, direct variation is a set of order pairs with a constant ratio. That ratio is y over x. That's how we find our k. Inverse is the opposite. It's a product where we're multiplying x and y. That's how we find the k pairs. The equation form of a direct is y equals kx. Inverse is y equals k over x. There are some given examples. To check to see is it direct, you can divide your y and x through all the ordered pairs, the tables, whatever. To check to see if it's inverse, multiply x and y. The graph of a direct is a line that goes through the origin. The graph of an inverse creates a hyperbola, the two curves. This is not necessarily correct, but if you want to participate, solve for k and then solve for missing third. And then the last two kind of go with the graph. Okay, flip over to the next page. And find any questions you want to see me go over on that page. So we are trying to determine, are these direct, inverse, or neither? Jackson.
Oh, it's gonna do 5 and 8.
5 and 8. Any others from this page?
Well,
7. Okay, 6. So let's start with them. Number 2 is already solved for y. Is this direct, inverse, or neither? Neither. Because it can't be direct because it has this y-intercept. So it is neither. For 5, this is going to be linear. We can solve it. It doesn't have a 0 in it, so I'm going to say it's going to be neither, but just to make sure, solve it, get x, get y by itself. So move x to the other side by subtracting, divide everything by -3. So we have y equals 1/3 x minus 5. It is linear, it is a line, but it doesn't have a y-intercept of 0, so it is neither. For number 6, Jackson.
what was that back there?
The equation. That's on the first page, the y equals kx. So here, if we were to solve this for y, how would we get rid of 2? Multiply on both sides. Y equals 2x. Is this direct, inverse, or neither? Direct. It is y equals kx, that is direct. Right, number 8, similar to number 5, but it has a 0, so it should be direct, but let's double check. Subtract x on both sides, y equals -x plus 0, leave off the 0, doesn't matter. Is this direct? Yes. Right, for 10 and 12, Max.
Number 6. But it need multiply the 2, the y 2.
Yeah, you're multiplying this side by 2, so that the 2's cancel.
Oh, so that would be 2y.
Well, 2y over 2 becomes just y. So for 10 and 12, you have to decide, do you think it's going to be direct or inverse? Start with that, and it either is or it's not, and then you check the other one. So for 10, do we think it's going to be direct or inverse? Inverse. So if it's inverse, if I multiply these, I should get the same thing for all of these numbers. So what's 31 times 270? Get that number again.
I didn't do solve earlier since I so
This 1,000.
20 times 140, whatever the rest of that is, these are not the same, it cannot be inverse. So then for direct, we have to divide y by x. So 217 divided by 31. 7. Is that what we got? 140 divided by 20. 119 divided by 17. And 84 divided by 12. 7. Right, you have to make sure they all work, because if one doesn't work, it's not whatever you were solving for. So these are all 7, so this is direct.
What's something, both the word?
Correct. Right, number 12, do we think it's gonna be direct or inverse? Okay, so let's multiply. 4 times 16, 5 times 1, 12.8, I'm sorry. 1.6 times 40, and 20 times 3.2. So it is inverse. Questions on any of those? Go on to the next page. Questions on this page?
Because that would be
Any? Let's start with those. If we have more, we'll talk about those. So 17, is that direct, inverse, or neither? Inverse. It looks like the hyperbola. That is inverse. 18, direct, inverse, or neither? Neither. It's not a line and it's not the hyperbola. It is neither. 19 is just like the tables. Decide if we're gonna do direct or inverse, and then either divide or multiply. So direct or inverse. Okay, so we are dividing if it's direct. So 8 over -6. Leave it in fraction form, what would that be?
negative.
Leave it as a fraction. Negative. Okay. And then 12 over -4. Not 1/3, not 2/3, just 3. So if these are not the same, it's not direct. So let's try inverse. If we multiply -6 and 8, -48, -4 and 12, -3 and 16, and -2 and 24. So it wasn't. Usually we will have covered mapping, but we haven't, so I'm just going to tell you how to read this. Each arrow is telling you what X goes with what Y. So this is 3 goes with 2, 6 goes with 4, 12 goes with 8, 18 goes with 12. But on the next page, there's one where it's like crossing, but it's still doing the same thing. You can see 1 goes with 20, X goes with 20. So with these, we're going to do the same thing. Do we think this is direct or inverse? Okay, so if we did try inverse, if we multiply 3 times 2, 2 times 3 is 6, 4 times 6 is 24, and then we direct y divided by x, 2 divided by 3, 4 over 6, we simplify 2, 2 divided by 3, 8 divided by 12, third, and 12 divided by 8. Also, third. Great. Other questions on this page before we move on? 13, sure. Direct or inverse? Got your inverse first, so let's multiply 2 times 1.5. 4 times 3. Oh, so it's not inverse. Direct 1.5 divided by 2. Three divided by 4. So then it's neither.
Oh, this one's.
Yes.
It's direct.
Oh,
I said
this
I-
one was.
I didn't, sorry, I was. But it was direct. If you check them all, I did not check.
Is that direct, inverse, or neither? Direct. It's a line, it goes to the origin. It would be neither. Inverse looks like this.
Oh,
Right. Say that one more time. So. Then it's inverse. But if you're dividing, then it's direct. Okay. On to the next page. Questions on any of these? Jackson? Number 4. So I will say, these are both like something we already did. For number 2, if you can recognize that that's the equation for either your K or your inverse or direct, you don't have to solve it. Is this one of your equations? Yeah. Or which one? Inverse. Now, if you wanted to still solve it, solve for y, divide both sides by x. And you see that that's also your equation for inverse. So either or you should get inverse. This is gonna be linear. Is it gonna go through the origin? Just by looking at it? No. No, it's gonna be neither. You could solve it just to make sure.
How do you know if it goes to?
It has a y-intercept of 0.
No.
It looks like this, but it has a y-intercept of 0. Okay, number 4, how would we solve for y? Multiply by 3. So y equals 3x. This is direct, inverse, or neither. Direct. And then for number 8, like the one we're just doing, 1 goes with 20, 4 goes with 5, and have that. Do we think this is direct or inverse? Let's double check. 1 times 20 is 20, 4 times 5, 8 times 2.5, and 10 times 20. Still show that you multiply, because that would be your work. On to the next page. Questions on this page? 11. You said 13. 12 again, 13. Let's start with that one. So 11, in which graph is y a direct variation of x? The only line that goes to the right. For number 12, if y varies directly as x and the constant of variation is -3, which equation represents this relationship? C and D, no, C would be inverse, D would be direct, because I could rewrite this, but this would be, -1/3, not 3. B doesn't work because it's not negative. For 13, they're telling us the point 2, -10 lies on the graph of an inverse variation, so we know we're using inverse, which represents the inverse variation. So first, we have to find K. How would we do that? And then we know it's inverse. Which of these would be our inverse variation equation? This is direct. This is inverse. So one, you have to read these carefully, make sure you are doing the right thing, because the wrong answers are there also if you do the wrong thing. For 14, same as 13, but now it's 12/4 is the point of a direct variation. We're looking for the constant of variation. How would we find it? 4 divided by 12, which is 1. It's not asking you to find your equation or an x or a y value. We can do 15 shortly. Great. So 2 order pairs that would form a direct variation. If it says 0, 0, that should automatically be 1. The other ones we'll have to see. So start dividing. 8 divided by 2 would give us 4. So anything that has the same K value will be direct. 9 divided by 4 is just gonna be a random list of it. 5 divided by 20. 20 divided by 5 is 4, but 1/4. 10 divided by 10. 3 divided by 12. And 18 divided by 2. So which of these are direct? Ones that say 1/4. So 12, 3, and 25. Correct. Other questions on this page? 8 divided by 2 goes into 8 4 times. But if it was the other way, 2/8, then it would be 1/4. Right, questions on 16 through 21? 20. Which one? The other 21. Okay. 18. For 17, y varies directly with x, so it's telling you it's direct. Which equation best describes the data? So first, find your K value, that'll help. Y divided by x. What would that simplify to? 3/5. And if I check that for each of these, each one should give me 3/5. So then, is there one that looks like y equals KX with
all the potential to water.
so for direct, it's y equals KX, K equals y over X. Nothing about X over Y. For 18, which table does not vary directly as X? So if we start to find the K value, if they're the same for all of them, not that one. Which one do we think might be? So let's try. If I'm dividing -1 over -2, what would that give me? 1/2. -2 divided by -1. 2. Already this is not the same, so it would, if I tried it for these, those would all be the same with all of the points. We'll do 20, I don't know if we'll have time for the first one. For 20, if y varies directly as x and y equals 3 when x equals 12, what is the value of y when x equals 18? So we did a bunch of problems like this. We have to find k first. How do we do that? Y divided by x. So 3 divided by 12, which is 1/4. Then we're looking for the value of y when x is 18. So in our equation, y equals kx. We don't know y, we know k, we know x. Double check it. It's definitely not 72. Say yes. Questions on that? We'll do that one, and then the last page when we get back, and then last minute questions, and then you guys will get your quiz. So for this 21, the first one, similar to 20, but now it's inversely. So if y is inversely proportional to x, y equals 7 when x equals 9, find x when y equals 14. We're gonna find k by doing what? Multiplying 7 and 9. This is what? 53. And then if we're trying to find x when y equals 14, set up your inverse equation. 14 equals 63 over x. How do we find x? Multiply both sides by x. Divide both sides by 1. What is it? Questions on either of those 20 or 21 before we do number 21 here? Okay. Word problems. The number of calories burned while jogging varies directly with the number of minutes spent jogging. If George burns 150 calories by jogging for 20 minutes, how many calories does he burn for jogging for 30 minutes? What's important? Varies directly, yes. 150 calories. 20 minutes. 30 minutes. How many calories does he burn? Burn is what that's supposed to say. It does not say that, but pretend it does. And then whatever comes before the words varies directly or any variation of that is y. Whatever comes after is x. The number of calories, all of those will be y. Number of minutes, all of those will be x. Are we looking for a y or an x? Y. So to find y, find your k first. Try doing one. Dividing, because it's directly. So 150 divided by 20, what would that be? I heard it, but not really. Right, sometimes that may be an answer choice if this is responsible choice, so be careful. Then use that to find your equation. How would we set that up? Times 30. Multiply that, what would that give us? 125. If you were writing this out, it would be calories. Make sure you put your labels. Questions on that one? And then over to the back. Any of those you want to see if you go over, have questions about? I heard 25 and 23. We'll do those two and then that. For a group of objects made of the same material, the weight of an object varies directly with its volume. If an object has a volume of 20 cubic inches and weighs 28 ounces, what is the constant of variation? What's important here? Varies directly. What else? Twenty cubic inches and weighs 28 ounces. What is the constant of variation? What are we looking for? Okay, your constant. How would we find that? 28 by 20 because it's the weight and volume. Leave it as a fraction. Should be 7. Because we did 28 divided by 20. Your weight over your volume. If we were putting our labels, that would be ounces over cubic inches.
What was it say? Varies and
Then you would be multiplying.
28 plus 20.
How would it feel? How would it end up?
So whatever comes before this is your y, whatever comes after is x. So if you have to do y divided by x, you have to know what y before x. Yes. Great. Start to read through 25. What's important there? Inversely proportional. Distance. Number of chairs. Chairs, 16 meters apart. Again, looking for constant. How would we find that? Multiply 80 and 15. The only one that would make sense here. But if you read it wrong and did it as direct, that answer is also there, so be careful. Any last minute questions before you guys take your quiz? If it's still collaborative, all of your notes need to be put away. You can have your calculator out. Go ahead and clear off your desk except for what you're writing with and your calculator.